Hi everybody, welcome for another episode of the Dissenter. So today my guest is Dr. Mark Schaller from the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada. Just to give you a quick introduction to Dr. Schaller, he graduated from the University of North Carolina in 1984 and we obtained the PhD in psychology at the Arizona State University in 1989. And he is currently professor of psychology, as I said, at the University of British Columbia in Canada. So, Dr. Schaller, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Okay, great. So, I guess that today we're going to talk about your work, of course, and I'm going to ask you a little bit about how human culture is generated, about the dynamic social impact theory, the behavioral immune system, and related topics. Okay, so to start off with, and I think I haven't yet asked this question specifically to any of my guests until now, but I think it's a rather important one to set straight before we start a conversation like this. That is, what is culture? Or, on the other hand, what, if you prefer, what is human culture?
It's a good question, and I think that if you ask that question of 1,000 people, you would get 1,000 different answers.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
I'll give you an answer that is, I think, inevitably incomplete, but is a good starting point, at least for the kind of research that my colleagues and I have done, which is that culture really is, it's defined to some extent by people's perception of the following things, that there are different populations of people that have somewhat different beliefs, rituals, habits, etc. So, to some extent, in order to have human culture, you need to have some population of people that have some defining characteristic. You know, they live in a particular place or whatever, and that those people have some collection of beliefs, habits, what have you, and that population's culture of beliefs, habits, etc., differ from the beliefs and habits of a different population that is demographically different in some way. So I think, in a sense, culture really depends upon like three ingredients. One, that a population of people have some habits, behavioral tendencies, attitudes, beliefs, etc., in common, that those things differ from those of other populations of people, and that it really is a bunch of things. It's not just that people over here believe one thing and people over here believe another thing, but people over here differ from people over here in a lot of different ways. And I think that's kind of the fundamental ingredients of culture. In addition to that, a lot of people who study human culture would make the argument that that at a psychological level, this stuff matters. That is, if I'm one of these people here, I have a set of beliefs and ways of doing things. And I think that really is, that's the best way, or that's right, or in some way it matters to me and who I am. And in addition to that, because it matters, people teach that stuff to other folks around them. They feel that it's important for other people to carry on those beliefs and traditions. And so for a lot of people who study human culture, this business of passing on these cultural norms from generation to generation is a defining part of it. So I guess that was not a simple answer, even though it's a very oversimplified definition of culture.
Yeah, from what I've been reading, culture is very difficult to define for both psychologists and anthropologists and other people who study human behavior, let's say.
That's right. I once was at a conference and somebody was given a talk about culture from a psychological perspective and gave a definition of culture that struck me as very reasonable and somebody else who was there in the audience whispered, "That's the wrongest definition of culture I've ever heard." So,
Yeah, okay, so leaving that question aside, how is culture generated in human societies? Because, I mean, there are different approaches to this question. So, for example, people that come mainly from evolutionary psychology, and I refer to people like, for example, John Tooby and LIETZCKE, they usually talk about culture as being an evoked process. So let's say kind of the result of individual level cognitive mechanisms that are shared within a particular human population. But in your work you focus a lot on the importance interpersonal communication might have in the development of culture. So could you talk a little bit about this?
sure. I'll start by saying that all of these different ways of understanding where culture comes from are almost certainly true. That is, there's not just one recipe for culture. So it is, and in some of the work that I've done on disease avoidance and the behavioral immune system fits very well within this context of evoked culture. So in that sense, it starts with this notion that different people live in under different ecological circumstances, and that the human mind evolved to be very adaptable to respond in a flexible way to the circumstances we're in. So people who in one circumstance may develop certain particular ways of doing things, certain ways of understanding their world, certain belief systems. People who grow up in a different ecological context, a different part of the planet, will respond very naturally to whatever the local ecology is there, will develop a particular way of doing things, and so forth. So even without any interpersonal communication, even without any social influence, there'll be clusters of people over here who are different from clusters of people over here. And that almost certainly does account for a lot of cultural differences. But of course, people do a lot of other things. We know that people do, in fact, communicate with each other an awful lot. We are an extremely communicative species. We have this amazing cognitive equipment that allows us for, the capacity for language and to communicate with each other in lots of different ways. And when people do communicate with each other, they influence each other. And so a lot of what does end up contributing to the emergence of culture, the emergence of cultural differences, and the persistence of those differences over time follows from the fact that people within a particular geographical area will communicate with each other and will mutually influence each other. People in another geographical area will communicate with each other and influence each other a lot, and that itself provides a recipe for the emergence of and the persistence of cultural differences over time. And some of the work that I had done pertaining to communication, and that other people have done as well, suggests that people don't just communicate arbitrarily. When we talk to each other, we talk about certain specific things, and we'll talk about certain specific things under certain specific circumstances more than others. And so those things that we actually talk about end up having a more of an impact on the culture that emerges in a particular place, or in the culture that actually persists over time in a particular place. So there's an enormous number of ways in which, in addition to the fact that people simply adapt to different ecological circumstances, that when people do communicate, that also adds an additional way of understanding the emergence of culture.
Mm-hmm. So would you say that a fair assessment of what you just said would be to say that we as humans in all places share the same common underlying psychology, and because in different environments we get different inputs, thanks to the plasticity that our cognitive mechanisms allow, then we get different outputs, or somewhat different outputs, according to the input we get from the environment, and also the fact that people, while communicating with each other, also influence each other. So are these the two main aspects that influence the generation of culture?
I hesitate to say they're the two main aspects that do. I will say that it seems, based upon a lot of research that psychologists and other behavioral scientists have done, that those are two important ways in which culture does develop, and through which we can understand why cultures in some places are different than cultures in other places. Almost certainly there's other contributing factors as well, but those are certainly two important ones, and those are the two ones that, well, based upon the work that I've done, I know most about. So those are the ones that I'll feel most comfortable talking about.
Okay, so and now to talk a little bit more specifically about the dynamic social impact theory. That is a theory for which you yourself contributed greatly, and it involves, I think that there are three main aspects to it. That is consolidation, clustering, and correlation. Could you please explain each of these three aspects?
Sure, and I should say that really, although I've done work on the role of communication in the generation of culture and the perpetuation and change of culture, I've never really done much on dynamic social impact theory, and I think when I think of dynamic social impact theory, I don't think of myself. I think of BLANCHETTE and his colleagues who've done amazing work in that area. And what dynamic social impact theory does is it provides a way of understanding how culture emerges almost accidentally and inevitably simply as the product of people communicating with each other. So the basic idea is that, well, let's go back to your question where you brought up these three buzzwords of consolidation, clustering, and correlation. What consolidation means in the context of dynamics social impact theory is simply that over time, as people communicate with each other, they become to share similar beliefs, similar habits, similar ways of doing things. Clustering is simply a fancy way of saying that, well, the thing that I talked about earlier, that people over here tend to have different beliefs than people over here. And correlation is simply making the point that that it's not just one belief over here, but there's lots of different beliefs over here that are different than the beliefs that people have over here. So the way of getting there through dynamic social impact is really simple. It essentially says, if you have the following facts, you're going to have those outputs. And those facts are: people communicate with each other. Okay, we know that happens. People influence each other as a consequence of communicating with each other, and we know that that happens. You and I can talk with each other, and inevitably, some things that you will say will have an influence on me, and perhaps inevitably some things that I say will have an influence on you. So people do just naturally learn from and mutually influence each other simply as a product of communicating. And one other important ingredient here is that some people are more influential than others. And what dynamic social impact theory, I forgot one other important ingredient. When we communicate with each other, we don't just communicate randomly. We tend to communicate, especially with the folks who are geographically closer to us. And so what dynamic social impact theory essentially shows is, or research on dynamic social impact theory shows, is if you have those ingredients, what happens is over time, different cultures emerge. And that is, you get this emergence of clustering. people over here believe something different than people over here, you get the emergence of consolidation that, most of the people here begin to believe the same sort of things and eat the same sorts of foods and engage in the same sorts of behaviors. And similar, the same thing is happening over here. And you have this emergence of correlation, which is that seemingly random things tend to, over here, might get connected to each other. The people over here tend to simply have similar dietary preferences, engage in certain particular behaviors, have certain kinds of beliefs that tend to all kind of correlate together. So the key point that dynamic social impact theory makes is that it doesn't take much for the emergence of cultural differences over time. All it really takes is some of these basic facts of communication, that people communicate, that they communicate more with people closer in space to them than with people further away, that some people, or that when people communicate, they influence each other, and that some people are more influential than others. You start with those basic facts, and you get this emergence of recognizable and persistent cultural differences over time.
Mm-hmm. And there's also other aspects to the communicability of ideas and skills between people. So, for example, you also talk in your work about the concepts of stickiness, pitchiness, and catchiness. So, how does each of these aspects of communication influence how ideas are transmitted among people and how they stick in their minds?
Yeah, so this is important in addressing a question about why it is that certain things, rather than others, tend to become part of the cultural norms. What dynamic social impact theory essentially does is say, hey, simply as a product of communication and the influence that happens during communication, the contours of culture emerge. But it doesn't really say anything about the specific contents of cultures. So it's a different question entirely as to why certain things tend to become cultural, why they tend to become normative and persist in being normative, whereas other things aren't. And that's where these issues of stickiness, pitchiness, and catchiness matter. So the idea here is that people do communicate with each other, but we don't communicate randomly. People will talk more about some things than others. And the things that people will talk about to other folks depend first and foremost on what comes to mind. If you tell me something and then I'm telling somebody else about things, I'm not going to tell them about what you told me unless I actually remember what you told me. So those things that are sticky, that tend to be more memorable, that tend to pop into mind more readily, tend to be the sort of things that people will transmit to other folks, and so those things will become more cultural, they'll become more normative over time. Additionally, even if I remember a whole bunch of things, I'm not going to talk about everything that I remember. I will perhaps strategically or for whatever reason, I will choose to communicate about some things more than others. In a sense, this is what pitchiness is. I could pitch 10 different things to you, but I will choose to pitch only 3 different things to you, and it's those choices that determine what gets transmitted. So some things are just more likely to be communicated from one person to another, and those things will become more culturally popular and persist in their popularity. And then there's the catchiness, which is that regardless of what I might attempt to communicate to you, you might not receive all of those equally. You might receive some with greater fidelity than others. And so it's those things that are, in a sense, successfully transmitted from me to you, and from you to other people, and from me to other people. Those are things that will become more culturally popular. So the main point is that if we're to understand why some things become culturally widespread and remain culturally widespread, it's really important to dig inside the human mind a bit more deeply and try to understand what kinds of things are especially memorable, what kinds of things are people especially inclined to attempt to communicate to other folks, and what kinds of things are actually more likely to be successfully received, successfully transmitted to other people. And it's by understanding how memory processes works, by understanding people's interpersonal motivations and so forth, we can better predict what kinds of things through the act of communication are likely to become and remain culturally popular.
Okay. And is there any evidence or a good amount of evidence to say that, for example, what people most usually talk about among themselves are the things that are most evolutionarily relevant to them? Let's say things related to reproduction, to survival, kin selection, and things like that.
It's tempting to make that argument. It's hard to convincingly gather evidence of that. That is, we know from a lot of psychological research that there are many things that are at some level relevant to reproduction goals, at some level relevant to survival goals, even if they're not obviously relevant to those sorts of things. So it's very hard to come to carefully track the connection between the specific, often kind of random, tedious, dumb things that people might talk about to these much broader evolutionary goals. My bet is, yeah, some of them, even if they're not obviously related to those evolutionary considerations, do in some way tap into it. But my bet is that a lot of the stuff that people communicate truly is just random crap. So it's a little hard to. It's very hard, based upon the evidence that I know of, to say that most of what people talk about is relevant to these broader evolutionary considerations. What is clear from a lot of scientific research is that things that are demonstrably that many things that are demonstrably relevant to reproduction goals and survival goals do show up in what people talk about. And there is work, for instance, that shows that traits that people have that seem more relevant to things like danger and safety. You know, are you a person who's going to help me, or are you a person who's going to harm me? I'll be more likely to communicate to other people about those kind of traits than I will about things that are less danger relevant. Or another example that I've always liked has to do with urban legends. You know, these things that pass through culture, that become part of the contemporary mythology of a culture. And there's some wonderful work that Chip Heath and his colleagues did some years ago that looked at the content of urban legends and trying to understand how the content of urban legends predicted which urban legends did become popular, which did become part of kind of the cultural mythology, and which ones weren't. And one of the interesting findings was that urban legends that tended to arouse disgust tended to be especially likely to be communicated and to become culturally popular. And that's interesting in relation to your question, because disgust is very much an emotion that is related to a fundamental, an evolutionary fundamental motivation regarding the avoidance of diseases. So it's a nice example of how certain things that do tap into survival goals do end up being especially communicable, and from one person to another, and as a consequence of that, become more culturally popular, in a sense, become a more lasting part of a local human culture. Mm-hmm. And that's just one example.
Okay. So, and now to talk a little bit about one very specific component of culture that I think is common across all human cultures, that is stereotypes. Does the evidence show that people tend to focus more on certain particular traits of other peoples, people from outgroups, when they decide what to include in the stereotypes?
Yes, there is so there's a lot of different, well, lots of different stereotypes that people have of lots of different groups. It's pretty clear that from a lot of work that people have done that stereotypes tend to focus a lot on first and foremost the dimension of whether somebody is nice or nasty, somebody who's going to hurt me or not hurt me, friend or foe. That those sorts of traits tend to become very important, and presumably because those have been of great evolutionary relevance throughout a great deal of human history. In addition, stereotypes tend to focus on the content of whether a group is competent and able, or less competent and less able, and that too has practical implications for one's own survival and so forth. And there is evidence that suggests that though some of those components tend to be especially, well, traits that pick up on some of those components tend to be especially likely to be communicated when people are talking about members of other groups. And some work that my students and I did some years ago showed that if you took some existing stereotype of a group and looked at the particular contents of it, the particular contents that tended to be more communicable, that people are just more likely to talk about, were more likely to persist over time, whereas traits that were of less interpersonal interest, and therefore people are less likely to talk about when they're talking about some group, those features of the stereotypes tended to, over time, disappear from the cultural stereotype. So by understanding what people are inclined to talk about, can help us predict what aspects of a group stereotype are likely to persist from generation to generation versus what aspects of a group stereotype are likely to change over time.
Mm-hmm. And another very interesting aspect of cultural communication, at least I find personally very interesting, is the concept of minimally counterintuitive ideas. How does this concept allows us to better understand the narrative processes that are behind the most successful folk tales and religious stories and things like that?
Yeah, this relates to the concept of stickiness primarily. The idea that some things are more memorable than others, and if they're more memorable, then we're more likely to talk about them and teach them to other people and so forth. And so work that my colleague Ara Noranzayan did was focusing on this notion of minimally counterintuitive stories. So the idea is that some stories, you can think of a folk tale, a fairy tale, a Grimm's Brother fairy tale, for instance. Some stories have mostly mundane content. Some stories have lots of crazy, fanciful, magical content, and some stories have some mostly mundane, ordinary content, plus just a little bit of fanciful, magical content. And it's that latter category of stories, it turns out, that people tend to find most memorable. If it's just totally ordinary, mundane stuff, whatever, it comes across as maybe a little boring. If it's just got all kinds of crazy, magical things in it, maybe it's just a little bit overwhelming. It just doesn't connect to reality. But these stories that are mostly, fit with our intuitive understanding of how the world works, but are just minimally counterintuitive, just have a little bit of a magical element in it. Those stories tend to hit some sort of sweet spot where people remember them better and seem to be more likely to tell other people those stories. And as a result of that, it's these stories that are minimally counterintuitive, that tend to be transmitted from one person to another, and as a result tend to become more culturally popular and persist as part of the cultural narratives that are told generation after generation. And so, in some of this work that I did with Nora and Zion, we did this analysis of Grimm's Brothers fairy tales, and of which there are a lot, a lot that I'd never heard of. And the interesting finding was that the ones that most people in European populations have heard tend more likely to be, just have a, 2 or 3 magical counterintuitive elements, and the ones that tended to have less than that or a lot more than that tended not to have become culturally popular. So there's some sense that just having a little bit of magic in the folktale, but not too much and not too little, makes it stickier, makes it more memorable, makes it pitchier, makes it more likely that people will share those stories with others.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so and now to move to the behavioral immune system. So I guess it has an individual component, but also a sort of a collective cultural component, because it works at the level at the individual, while trying to avoid certain sources of infectious disease.
Right.
But then with time and while people interact with one another, it kind of gets put into a cultural moral code. The way people try to avoid these sources of infection then develop into moral code. So is there here a connection between pathogen sensitivity, that is pathogen disgust, and moral disgust?
Yes, and there's and feel free to interrupt me if I just start talking too much. But there's also there's an interesting connection between pathogens and diseases and culture generally, including the moral rules that govern cultural behavior. And there's an interesting connection to understanding cultural differences and why people in some parts of the world have different cultural norms and in parts of other parts of the world. So I can talk about all of that if you'd like.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the basic idea, the starting point here is that throughout a great deal of human evolutionary history, infectious diseases posed an enormous risk to survival and therefore to reproductive fitness. And it's because of that, of course, that we human beings, like most living species, develop some sort of immune system to help fight off these disease-causing pathogens when they get inside our bodies. But the immune system that fights off these pathogens when they get inside our bodies is a great thing to have, but it's kind of terrible when you actually have to use it. It consumes an enormous amount of metabolic resources, and of course it's only kicking in when those pathogens are already inside the body. So it'd be additionally wonderfully beneficial to have an additional set of mechanisms, psychological mechanisms, that help us engage in behavior that prevents those pathogens from getting inside our body in the first place. And it's that set of psychological mechanisms that I and other people sometimes refer to as the behavioral immune system. And so it operates very much at an individual level. I see something or someone who seems to pose some risk of infection that will arouse a negative response in me, including the emotion of disgust. And it will also lead me to engage in a variety of behaviors that will prevent me from coming into contact with that thing or that person. So it has implications for prejudices of various sorts toward various kinds of people who might look unusual or different, and in some way. It has implications for conformity behavior, and this ties into culture in some important ways. So here's that connection. The anthropologists have suggested that a lot of cultural norms exist as cultural norms in part because they serve the function of preventing pathogens from being transmitted from one person to another. You know, we cook food in a certain way. You know, when we prepare food in a certain way, because eating food is a necessary thing, but it's also a dangerous thing. If I'm sick and I'm preparing your food, then there's the potential for me to transmit my disease to you. So certain rituals of food preparation help prevent the spread of pathogens. There's various other rituals and cultural norms in various domains governing sexual behavior, interpersonal behavior of various sorts.
Sorry, just to interrupt you
Sure.
there. Is a good example of how particular thing that people do while preparing food and related to the behavioral immune system, the use of spices.
Yeah, that's right.
In certain areas of the globe, like the Middle East and South America.
That's right. So, in fact, it's one of my favorite examples is how spices, virtually all spices, are natural antibiotics, and so the use of spices in food preparation is a way of killing some of the bacterial agents that get into food, and that's especially important in places that are closer to the equator, where bacteria are more prevalent and are more likely to get into food, which is one explanation for why culinary practices in populations that live closer to the equator tend to involve a greater use of spices. So the cultural differences in the spiciness of food is a great example of how these norms emerge and persist as a way of keeping the transmission of diseases at bay. And so you can imagine that if I am preparing food in one of these locations and I'm failing to use spices, that causes a problem. So it's a great example of a particular kind of cultural norm that is serving that seems like, yeah, whatever. It's just the way we prepare food, but it's actually serving this disease this disease prevention function. And so one of the interesting implications then is that more broadly, since a lot of norms serve the function of preventing diseases, then there will be, in a sense, another kind of cultural norm that's likely to emerge, almost a meta-norm that suggests that you shouldn't violate norms. You should conform to the existing traditions and practices in the culture that you live. And if you do violate those norms, then you're not only putting yourself at risk, but you're putting other people at risk. And so people who violate norms are going to be judged as being, morally wrong in some way. And it's no surprise that if in fact a lot of norms are serving the function of the prevention of diseases, that when we encounter people who violate norms, that those norm violations will arouse a sense of disgust, the emotion that is associated with the threat of disease. So that may be why the threat of in a sense, the experience of disgust is not just aroused by the perception of things that pose an obvious disease threat, but also why the experience of disgust in the context of moral disgust is aroused by the perception of anybody who violates a norm that people perceive to be important. And so there's a lot of interesting connections there too between these disease avoidance mechanisms and culture. Another interesting connection has to do with the prediction of cultural differences across the planet. Shall I talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. And again, feel free to interrupt if I go off on a tangent. So this is an example of how one can understand this basic evolved equipment we all have, that evolved in the service of preventing us from coming into contact with diseases, but how it can, in combination with an understanding of the fact that there's ecological differences in different parts of the planet, help us understand how cultural differences emerge and persist. So the idea is that in places on the planet that are especially diseasey, where disease-causing pathogens have historically been highly prevalent, that it would be especially important to engage in certain kinds of behaviors that help keep diseases away from people. And in other parts of the planet where diseases have been less prevalent, where there's just less of a potency or less of a diversity of disease-causing pathogens, there may be greater tolerance for those kinds of behaviors. So a good example has to do with conformity behavior. So, a few minutes ago I was saying how conformity behavior serves its useful function. If people conform to the way, cooking practices and hygiene practices and other norms, historically that help keep diseases at bay. So there's these disease-specific benefits that have historically been associated with conformity behavior. But let's not kid ourselves. There can be certain costs associated with conformity behavior as well. If people are conforming to the way that they've always done things, then they're less likely to discover new things that could be beneficial. They may be less creative. There'll be less scientific innovations, less technological innovations. So the key point then is that the benefits, the disease avoidance benefits of conformity will be more likely to outweigh the costs of conformity in ecological circumstances in which diseases have historically posed a threat. Whereas in places where diseases have not been so likely to pose a threat, the benefits of conformity may be less and actually may be outweighed by the costs of conformity. The implication then is that one should expect to see a greater emphasis on conformity in populations that are characterized by and have historically been characterized by a high risk of disease, or a high prevalence of pathogens. And so one actually finds this by looking at cultures around the world. In cultures that have historically existed in places that are more diseasey, there's evidence that there's a greater emphasis on obedience and conformity to existing traditions. There's less tolerance for nonconformity. People are judged more harshly if they fail to conform, and so forth. So I think it's a nice example of how, by understanding these basic evolved mechanisms of the behavioral immune system, can actually help us understand how certain cultural differences have also emerged and persist over time.
Yeah, and another very interesting thing that I read in your work and the work of other people is that there's a very strong correlation, or I think it's a very strong one, between people that live in places where there's a higher prevalence of infectious diseases and the prevalence of certain very specific personality traits like extroversion and openness to experience. They tend to be less extroverted and less open to experience, right?
That's right. So the openness to experience fits with the conformity example I described earlier, that being open to new things is great in some ways, but it also can be costly, especially if that openness to new things leads me to not do the things that we have done conventionally within my culture over time. The implication being, in more diseasey ecologies, people will be less inclined to have a personality trait of openness to experience. Similarly, extroversion is interesting. There's benefits to extroversion. I meet more people. I'm interested in, I'm more socially engaged. I'm likely to talk to strangers, all of which could lead to, the development of new beneficial relationships. But there can be particular costs to being extroverted, essentially being socially gregarious. If I'm willingly putting myself in proximity to lots of new people, to strangers, I'm also exposing myself potentially to diseases that those people might have. So the implication is that in places where diseases have been more prevalent, the benefits of extroversion may be more likely to be outweighed by the costs of extroversion, with the implication that does show up in data that's been collected by personality psychologists around the world. The implication that in ecological circumstances that are more diseasey, people, as cultural populations, tend to have lower levels of extroversion. So it's another example of how, in this case, just the basic personality traits that characterize people in a culture can be predicted in part by understanding the pathogen prevalence in the local ecological environment.
Mm-hmm.
I should also say, I'm sorry, I'll just add one more thing, that it's worth keeping in mind that, this kind of research, looking at the correlation between pathogen prevalence and cultural differences, it's merely correlational. So it's really, really hard to draw causal conclusions about what caused what. So it's interesting to note that parallel to that work on pathogen prevalence and cultural differences, there's a lot of experimental work that people have done. I've done some of this myself, and lots of other people have too, that show that one can actually manipulate people's temporary concerns with the threat of disease, and you find similar consequences. So if people are just in an experiment made to be temporarily freaked out by the threat of disease, that leads them temporarily to be less extroverted, to be less open, to be more conformist, to be less tolerant of nonconformists, and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And do you think that to better understand how people's disgust sensitivity can lead to stigma and social prejudice, that we could perhaps add error management theory to the behavioral immune system, that is the theory that it would be more beneficial in evolutionary terms for people to avoid as much sources of infection, even though our cognitive systems are not really perfectly attuned to detect them, and then it would be more beneficial to avoid as many potential sources as we could, instead of risking being in contact with them, and then that would get out of hand, of course.
That's right, and I think that's I love error management theory, and I think that perspective is very important. And in the context of disease avoidance, it clearly is very important. The idea, of course, being that if I'm trying to make some decisions based upon whether I perceive somebody to be safe to interact with, or perhaps not safe to interact with, because I think they either are healthy or maybe they're diseased, in an ideal world, I would get that right. But it's not an ideal world. I'm drawing my inferences based upon all kinds of superficial cues and somebody's behavior patterns, whatever. I'm going to make mistakes. But some mistakes are more costly than others. And one possible mistake I could make is somebody could be perfectly healthy, and I would judge them to be sick, and therefore I would avoid interacting with them. That's one mistake. Another mistake is a person could be sick, I would judge them to be healthy, and therefore I would, get close to them and engage in a close interaction with them. That's also a mistake. That second mistake historically is likely to have been a more costly mistake. Because avoiding a healthy person, whatever, maybe I lose the opportunity to make a new friend. Interacting with somebody who's carrying a potentially deadly bacterial infection, well, that could potentially kill me. So the argument then is that our minds evolved not simply to avoid mistakes, but our minds evolved in such a way that we're inclined to avoid the especially costly mistakes, even if that leads us, as a consequence, to make lots and lots and lots of the less costly mistakes. And a lot of work suggests that this does govern how we interact with other people, that we will, particularly if we're concerned about disease, will be especially likely to err on the side of caution and to avoid interacting with people who, at a purely superficial level, look like they might have some sort of infectious disease, even if rationally we know that they're perfectly healthy. If somebody just looks or acts a little weird, we'll have this potentially an automatic kind of revulsion response and a tendency to avoid them. And that is a consequence of this better safe than sorry cognitive bias that seems to be built into us as a result of because it has historically served our ancestors in avoiding avoiding premature death and therefore facilitating reproduction.
Mm-hmm. Yes, exactly. And so, just perhaps a last question.
Sure.
What would you say is the relationship between evolutionary psychology and cultural psychology, in the sense that in what ways do they interrelate with each other, and how does the knowledge that comes from one of the fields contribute to better understanding the findings that come from the other, and vice versa?
It's a good question, and I'm glad you asked it, because there is a tendency for people sometimes to think that evolutionary psychology, which is focusing on, the long history of the human population and understanding what is common among all people, is somehow incompatible with the study of cultural psychology, which is focusing on these differences between different populations of people. And I've always thought that's an unfortunate and insufficiently informed attitude, because in fact, evolutionary psychology and cultural psychology are perfectly complementary. Evolutionary psychology is devoted to an understanding of, those things that all people have in common, the basic cognitive capacities that all people have, which includes, of course, the capacities to respond flexibly to whatever environment we're in. It includes, of course, the capacity for language and the capacity to communicate with other people in lots of different ways. It includes the capacity to influence other people and to be influenced by them. These are basic human capacities, and they fit very nicely with the enterprise of cultural psychology, which of course is designed to understand how cultures, different populations of people do have different norms, different belief systems, and importantly, part of cultural psychology is designed to understand why there are these cultural differences. And the enterprise of evolutionary psychology does provide lots of important ingredients to help us understand that part of cultural psychology, by understanding how these basic human capacities that evolved across all human populations operate in specific circumstances, can help us understand why right here and right now some human populations have different beliefs, different habits, different norms than other human populations. So anyway, I identify strongly with both evolutionary psychologists and cultural psychologists, and especially with that set of evolutionary psychologists who are cultural psychologists, and that set of cultural psychologists who are evolutionary psychologists. They really are perfectly compatible and beautifully integrative research enterprises.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, Dr. Schaller, just before we finish this, and by the way, after we say our goodbyes here, please don't end the call, because I would just like to give you a quick word, okay? So, okay, so, but just before we finish this, would you like to perhaps share with people where they can follow your work, perhaps some interesting piece of work you're doing right now? I don't know if you're active on social media or not, things like that.
I'm not active on social media, but people can Google my name and find my lab webpage and find out a little bit more about what I'm doing. Most of what I'm doing right now is most of the work that I'm doing now has moved on from the topics we've talked about. I am doing a little bit of work on social influence processes as they relate to cultural change over time. I don't really have a whole lot to say about that right now. And I've been doing some additional work on a different evolved motivational system that we didn't talk about, that involves, it's the motivational system that evolved to facilitate the provision of protection and care to children. And what my students and I have been doing is looking at how this parental care motivational system matters not just for parents and their children, but actually has lots of interesting implications for everybody. So these are the kinds of things I'm doing. But I don't have any social media site to plug. But if people are interested in any of the things that we've talked about, they can Google my name and find out more.
Okay, but I guess that the work you're doing right now would be a very good reason to have you on in the future.
Sure.
Again. Okay, so Dr. Schaller, I would really like to thank you for taking a bit of your time to being here with us today. I think it was a really good conversation, a very informative one. And
thank you.
Again, thank you.
All right.
If you appreciate my work, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/the Dissenter. Thank you.